If you've ever wished you had a podcasting pro with nearly a decade of experience whispering growth secrets into your ear, that's exactly what you'll get when you tune into Podcast Growth Tools with me, your host, Kylie Chandler. This is the ultimate show for you if you're ready to grow your podcast audience, skyrocket engagement, and turn your show into a traffic-driving, list-building powerhouse. I've been in the podcasting world since 2015, helping creators like Amy Porterfield grow their shows to over 1 million downloads a month. My superpower? Breaking down proven podcast strategies and marketing techniques into step-by-step guidance you can actually implement without fluff, overwhelm, or guesswork. On this show, we're getting real about what actually moves the needle when it comes to growing your podcast audience and using it to boost your email list growth. From actionable insights and expert interviews to behind-the-scenes secrets, I'll help you turn your podcast into a traffic-driving, list-growing machine. Grab your earbuds, hit subscribe, and let's take your podcast to the next level. Hey, welcome to Podcast Growth Tools. I have such a special guest today. His name is Trent Anderson, and he is the head of growth and strategy at Podchaser. So that means that he is like deep in the world of podcasting. He knows like all of the insights, all of the data points. He's such a wealth of knowledge. I actually stumbled upon him on LinkedIn, and I was just so impressed by his knowledge, by the things he had to say and the updates in the industry, and just how his team at Podchaser is really aiming to make the data and the metrics that we use as podcasters to really understand our growth and understand our impact, and how they're really working to make it more easy and more user-friendly and easier to digest. So Trent and I had a great conversation. We dive into some of the biggest pain points that we are seeing podcasters struggle with so far in 2025. We also talk about the importance of data-driven decision-making when it comes to being a podcaster and marketing and promoting your podcast and pulling different levers. And so that's where we really get into what the data and the metrics mean, how we can simplify them, how we can understand them better. And he has so much information, so many insights for you here. We also talk about trends that we as podcasters should be aware of in the podcasting landscape, and also just other tools that could really support us. So this was a great episode. I loved how we got into a lot of the data pieces, the metric pieces. We also talk about moving to YouTube, what that looks like, Trent's thoughts on it. Overall, it was just such an organic conversation. I felt like I had notes and then we just kind of flowed with it. So I really love this conversation so much. I know you're going to fall in love with it as well. You're going to glean so much insight and walk away with so many new ideas. And I think just like a refreshed sense of self as a podcaster, knowing that there's so much more to the metrics than what meets the eye and the vanity metrics. So I'm really excited for you to check this episode out. I know you're going to love it. So let me know. And always, if you want to be the first to know about insights, trends, podcast episodes, be sure that you are on my email list. You can head to podcastmarketinghub.com/subscribe. I would love to have you over there with me. I send you a little newsletter each week with usually a funny story, some podcast insights, some updates, all that good stuff, just to keep you a pulse on the industry, all that good stuff, and serve you as best as I can. So thank you for being here. Enjoy this episode. All right. Welcome to the show, Trent. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kylie. Really excited for our conversation today.
So I know you're a pro in podcasting. And of course, I shared a lot about your experience and expertise in the intro. So I'm really excited to just dive in. And I want to start at, in 2025, the podcast landscape has changed so much over the years. But what are you seeing podcasters struggle with most right now? And what are some things that they can be doing to kind of work against those struggles?
I think the biggest question podcasters are facing right now is what to do with video. And it's a huge question, and it's not right for everybody. I think, again, with the backdrop of TikTok, and is it going away? Is it going to stay? Is it going to be acquired by somebody else? YouTube, what are we doing? It's the second largest search engine in the world, and it's owned by Google. It's a huge question, and I don't think video is right for everybody. I do think it kind of depends on the podcaster's goals. And when it comes to goals, I think a lot of podcasters have to ask themselves in 2025 and beyond, like, what is the reason for my podcast? Is this something that I'm getting a ton of personal utility out of? Is it me documenting my learning journey? Or is it something where I do want to take the steps to become a full-time creator? There's no right or wrong answer, but I do think it benefits folks to have a really in-depth conversation with yourself about it. So I think when it comes to video, there's room for everybody with video, and obviously tools such as Riverside and some of the others that exist out there make it infinitely easier. But again, like if you are going out and trying to like build your creator business, and this is no longer something that you're doing in your 5 to 9, and you're instead trying to make it your 9 to 5, I think being smart about video is it's taking different shapes and forms. And I think we'll get into some of this conversation, but I think it's fundamentally changing some of like the podcast format, truthfully, where there's been this kind of shift away from guest oriented shows and really making it more of a spotlight type of show. And I think one guy in particular that's doing a really good job of this is Jay Klaus, who hosts Creator Science. And I think you know Jay too. And seeing his transformation and how he's made content creation like his full-time thing. Obviously, it's not the blueprint that everybody has to follow, but if you're looking for inspiration, guys like Jay are doing an amazing job of that and offer the rest of us, I think, some interesting learnings along the way.
I'm so glad you brought it up. And I love that we just dove into it right from the start. But when, let's say somebody feels like they could tackle video, because there is a lot of pressure as a podcaster to get on YouTube. And of course, now they're saying that's where most people are listening to their podcasts and everything like that. What are just some ways that you can still make it fit? Like if you can't, because it's a lot of competition, right? You do have people who are very experienced. They have a full team that's creating this gorgeous video. Like, what are some ways that we can, as podcasters, still use and tap into that platform without creating like having to pay an entire team to do it? Like, is it worth just putting up a video that's nothing fancy, but it gets the content out there?
I think it can be. Again, it kind of goes back to the goals, right? So if you are just doing this as a hobby or as a means to get your creative juices flowing, that's fine. Like that's totally cool. Ultimately, I think what it comes down to for most folks is what gives you the most energy. Me personally, I've done enough video editing work where I know kind of what I'm doing, but it doesn't give me really any energy at all. So like I can get into one of these like free to use tools, or I can get into Adobe and start messing around. But all of a sudden I'm looking at it and it's taking me 4 hours to edit a 30-minute thing and then another couple hours to edit into clips for social. And it just doesn't give me a lot of energy. So I'd rather pour more of my heart and soul into like the content creation for the creation's sake, as opposed to being like this editor maestro, right? So again, it's not a one size fits all answer, but I do think when folks can find like which parts of the process really give them energy, that's going to unlock a lot of things. So that could end up being, hey, I really love the pre-production process where I'm gathering research, I'm fact checking evidence, I'm trying to find these different ideas or pull some of these narrative threads through. Sometimes that's going to be the thing that gives us the most energy. And I would actually say for something like that, maybe a companion piece to your podcast maybe should actually be a newsletter as opposed to going all in on video. Because again, if you're going to do all this research, you probably have a lot of written content. It's a lot more natural of an alignment to do an extension of your podcast into the newsletter format as opposed to going all in on video. So again, no one size fits all answer on that side of it, but just find what part of the process gives you energy. And maybe that is interviewing guests too. So like, I'm not saying that there's no room for guest-based shows anymore. That's certainly not the case, but maybe you just get a lot of personal utility out of hearing literally and seeing somebody that's offering up their expertise and subject matter interests as well. So that would be the overarching theme for me.
Mm. I love that. I think you have such a good point that it's not even so much strategic. It's more what gives me energy, and asking that and tapping into that, because it can feel very much like, oh, I'm left behind if I'm not doing a video. So thank you for your input. I think somebody with so much experience and expertise and the ability to look at so much data, is for you to come forward and say that. I think it feels good for some people to hear that. They need to. So speaking of data, what do you feel are some of the really fun, juicy ways that people can be growing their podcast, whether they're new or if they've been podcasting for a long time and they're finding that it's like stagnating and they're not seeing growth? Like what are people doing? What's really working right now?
Yeah, I think anytime you can get first party data from your audience, it's going to be to your benefit. And again, depending on which trajectory you want to go towards. So maybe again, this is just a hobby for you. It's still going to benefit you to get first party data about your audience. And this usually comes in the forms of surveys. So again, if you've got like the Spotify Q&A thing set up, or if you've got surveys that you're doing through another channel that you own, whether that's your newsletter or social channels, understanding who your audience is, what they like, what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes we call this like jobs to be done. If anybody's familiar with that concept, it was formalized by Clayton Christensen from Harvard Business Review. Oftentimes our listeners are hiring us to do something to help them accomplish a job that they are trying to get done. And that means like they could be at different stages of their journey. So maybe they're hiring you to get a leg up on a subject that they don't have a ton of knowledge about, but they're super interested in. So if they're hiring you to do that, then maybe that's going to dictate what kind of content you actually produce. So instead of doing more like anthropological, here's why XYZ industry is the way that it is. Instead, if they're like earlier on in their journey, maybe they need more how-to content. Maybe they need more step-by-step guides. Maybe they need more checklists and that sort of thing. So again, I think getting first-party data from our audience is going to be really helpful in our content and on the growth side. Also,
Before we go,
yeah.
Before you go on to something else, can you give like actual questions that if somebody hasn't done a survey yet,
Yeah.
what kind of questions would be really valuable instead of just throwing out some questions being like, doesn't really give me what I need?
Yeah. So a couple things. One would be, who are you? And these are going to be things like age, gender, occupation, what kind of company do you work at? What are your interests? What other podcasts do you listen to? And there's a good reason to ask that question, because that's going to open up opportunities for you to potentially look at other shows to be a guest on, so you can get some of the other people's audiences over to yours and kind of build that bridge between the two communities. And then I think from outside of like just the basic demographic questions, getting into some of the psychographic questions, like why did you start listening to the podcast? How did you first hear about the podcast? What are some of the things that we cover that you don't think anybody else does? What are some of the questions that we ask in our podcast that nobody else is asking? That's going to give you kind of second layer or second order information about who your audience is and ultimately why they consume your show. And then once you have, again, kind of these demographic questions done and some of these psychographic questions done, I think the next thing that we usually advise creators to do is start to build a plan around that. And again, if you're going after like more sponsorships, or if you want to monetize your show or go creator mode full time, these are going to be really important questions for advertisers. These are the same questions advertisers are going to ask you, right? And I think there's been this kind of long standing threshold that most podcasters are aware of, that you can't really monetize your show until you've got 10,000 listeners on a monthly basis. How true that is, I think it's increasingly less so. But when I'm working with brands, because I do work with a ton of brands on a daily basis, like they are much more interested now in looking for depth of audiences as opposed to just like pure reach. So again, if you get that first party data from your audience about who they are, what kind of makes them tick, that's going to be infinitely valuable to brands. And there's probably 6 or 7 different offshoots that we can go down when it comes to sponsorships and that sort of thing. But from like a survey construction perspective, demographic data and psychographic data would be what I'd start with.
Okay, I love that. I do want to go down that sponsorship route. However, I did interrupt you earlier and you were going to talk a little bit more about growth. So feel free to complete that thought and then we'll navigate that way.
Yeah. So in conjunction with the survey data from the growth side of things, I think one kind of tidbit that I picked up from Jeremy Enns, who runs Podcast Marketing Academy and is pretty well known within the space, is you've created the show for a reason. You probably have like a basic premise for why the show exists. But if you can identify people that you think should be listening to the show but currently aren't, literally just messaging them and saying, hey, I created this podcast to serve people like you. I don't think you listen to my show right now, but I'm curious, like, what would make you click on my thumbnail in Spotify or Apple and actually take a listen, right? And again, doing some more of like that market research and just trying to identify like these pockets of influence and having one-to-one conversations with folks. It takes a lot of effort, sometimes takes a lot of time. But if you've taken the time to build your premise for a show, like you should probably be reaching out to who you think your ideal listener profile is. So again, that's an idea borrowed from Jeremy, but I think that's another thing that I've seen shows when they've actually gone out and done that. It's unlocked some interesting growth trajectories for them too.
Okay, I love this because I'm all about reaching out to anybody who's new to your email list, just dropping them an email, or somebody who's new to following, or go. I love this strategy, going out, finding those people, because at the end of the day, like, especially the way I work with people is bringing customers into the world that become long-term clients and things like that. So when you're creating those super fans, it does happen in those DMs. I feel like it
Yeah.
does happen in just the human to human conversation. So I'm so glad you brought that up, and I love this. I mean, I get so excited when it's not like increase what you're doing on social media. Da, 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 da. It's just the old school way. I love it. So let's talk about sponsorships a little bit. How big does a show need to be, or how can some of these? I mean, I've been in the podcast industry, as have you, for many years, and Carly Baker from HubSpot and I kind of dubbed it the golden age of podcasting before all of the downloads dropped. And so it's a new landscape now. So what are brands looking for? Like, how many downloads does a show need to have, or what other data can we bring to them to make the show look attractive?
Yeah. So I think again, this 10,000 monthly downloads thing is still pervasive. Like actually, I just talked to a brand this morning. It's a project management tool that everybody knows. I've probably seen their YouTube pre-roll ads ad nauseum, and they're still looking for like that 10,000 monthly listen threshold. So like that still exists. That said, I don't think that should be a limiting factor in how folks consider like monetizing their show. And I'll break down like monetization into a couple different buckets. Like monetization, I'll call opening yourself up for like ads just to be injected into your program, whether it's through like Spotify, their kind of Spotify for Creators program, that sort of thing, where you don't have a ton of control over it, but you are going to make some pennies on the dollar. I think that is fine. It's probably going to give you some of that confidence to actually approach brands and go direct to brands with some of these things. And then the layer above that, I would call sponsorships. So these are going to be, again, brands that are going to want to tap into that parasocial relationship that you've built with your audience. And this is something we talk about a lot, because really, like, what is podcast advertising? What is podcast sponsorship? If we really boil it down, it's basically influencer marketing, but with way more trust. And we've got some really interesting data provided by us in conjunction with Acast, which of course is our parent company. And that trust in podcasters is like almost double that of trust in social media influencers, right? And it's because the podcast medium is so intentional. You don't just like get a drive-by listener from a podcast. Like they have to intentionally click on your cover art. They have to click on the episode that they want to consume. And then they're also tuning out a bunch of other distractions. So it's like a very intentional medium and a very focused medium. And that's really valuable to sponsors because they're getting crushed with rising costs in Meta and Google. They're getting crushed by, hiring these mega influencers that have millions of followers or whatever it might be. And they're not getting the return on investment in terms of like the dollar spent. So again, anytime you can kind of curate or create this community or this audience that is very interested in the depth in which you go in your content, that's again supremely valuable in the grand scheme of things when it comes to sponsors. So in terms of like what kind of thresholds should we be looking at for sponsors, again, I usually throw this back to the advertisers that I work with. It's like, okay, especially in B2B, if you wanted to get in front of 500 CFOs of fintech companies, and the only way for you to do that as a B2B brand typically is going to be going to like the national trade convention or the national show, whether it's CES or whatever it is. And you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars on flights and hotels, plus room and board, plus food. And then like maybe you're going to just so happen to have a sales rep schedule a meeting with the CFO on a conference floor. versus being able to tap into, again, a community that is comprised of people who care deeply about the content that you're creating. And we know that they're consuming it, and we know that they're coming back. Again, hopefully we're going to have some of our first party data from the surveys that we create to get some of that information. And then being able to put that in front of a sponsor and say, hey, again, you could go fly across the country, do your Silicon Valley events, or Miami or New York or Chicago, wherever it is. Or you could tap into our audience and get that same depth of audience more frequently, and not without having to spend, again, an arm and a leg in terms of getting mobilized for these types of like mega events, right? So I would say, like, in terms of continued learning when it comes to sponsorships, Justin Moore wrote a book called Sponsor Magnet that he released, I think, last month. I've read it a couple of times now, and it's an incredible resource for content creators, whether you're looking at sponsorships or monetization. I can't even do it justice in terms of like how deep he goes into his own frameworks about how to consider sponsorships, about how to go after certain brands that are going to be kind of more conducive to sponsoring your content. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. I would say like monetization should probably be the first step. Sponsorship should probably be the second step. And of course, you can go even further with that, with like name sponsors where they've got their logo on your cover art and all that kind of thing as well. But doing it in like a stepwise fashion usually makes sense.
Mhm.
And again, you want to use the first party data that you get from your audience to help support that.
I love that. I love how we came full circle and the importance of getting that listener data. Speaking of data, you, Podchaser, Acast, you guys are always hanging out in there, figuring things out.
Yeah.
And you're rolling out so many tools to really support us as podcasters and understanding this data. So it goes so much deeper than downloads. Can you talk to us a little bit about what downloads actually mean and what's more important, or what we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of alluded to this as we came out of the golden age of podcasting with the iOS update that absolutely nuked the download numbers across Apple. It was a hard time to be in the industry. There were a lot of people upset about it. Felt like the wool was pulled over a lot of people's eyes. I think we've come out of that, and there's a greater confidence in podcasting. And I know this because like our inbound lead flow on Podchaser Pro has almost doubled year over year. So like there's a significant amount of momentum and demand that's been just kind of created overnight. Really is an overnight that all kind of happened with the podcast election. And now all of a sudden brands are taking notice, like real meaningful content is being created and consumed in the audio format. So using that as backdrop, I would say. But some of the data points that we're really interested in looking at is the rise of video podcasts. So we've published a couple different things about how many podcasts have at least 1,000 YouTube subscribers. And we can maybe send this in the show notes, but we've got some interesting schematics and data points to look at there. And then in terms of other like data that starts to make sense, like Podchaser, we cover like 4 primary data points when it comes to podcasts. The first thing we look at is reach. So how many people are listening to shows on a monthly basis as well as a per episode basis. What's unique about us is we get reach from some interesting first party data sources, including podcast player apps, including what we call our verified publisher program, where we work directly with networks and publishers. We get their first party data in exchange to get some of our data. And of course, with Acast being our parent company, they host about 150,000 podcasts. We've got just an incredible depth of first party data when it comes to reach, which again allows us to do things like extrapolate that data across the entirety of the podcast industry. So reach is obviously always going to be part of the conversation. And then secondarily, audience. So we collect the social handles for all the shows across YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and X. That allows us to see things like age and gender splits, household income, parental status, marital status, interests, affinities, other brands they follow, other influencers they follow, and then like geographic and job title data in some cases as well. So all to say, like, what we're trying to do is create like the most comprehensive view of podcast data in the world. And the only reason why we really exist as a third-party aggregator is because your big 4 podcast companies, whether it's Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and then Google/YouTube, they've all tried to create walled gardens for themselves. And the self-interest in that, of course, is if they can capture as much advertising revenue on their platform, then that's going to raise their shareholder value and in turn make their companies much more valuable to the public markets. And that's where we step in, because that's great, but there's an element of hiding the ball in some cases. So our kind of goal is to democratize access to this data. Of course, it's not free, but in many respects, like if we can provide a much clearer understanding of where the podcast industry is and where it's going, again, that's going to have kind of that trickle down benefit to not just networks, not just the major shows, but also individual podcasters as well.
I love that. And I think it's such important work that you guys are doing, being able to compile all of that and kind of reveal the hidden gems in it. Um, so I still hear to this day, like the only thing I pay attention to is downloads. And I'm like, okay, well, we have some work to do. What would you say to those people who are listening who are only paying attention to downloads? Like what should we say to them to support them in understanding their show
Yeah.
more holistically?
Yeah, I mean, I think consumption's probably a better metric to look at. So like we take that into consideration, especially with our player app data. So like when a user goes in and clicks play and listens to an episode for 15 seconds, it's usually a more true estimate of what the actual audience consumption is. But then I know like Spotify has released some interesting features of late, and I know Bumper, Dan and his team have done some really interesting things with like their own proprietary data, where they're looking at how often are people actually listening through all the way to a podcast. And especially again, if you're monetizing or doing the sponsorship route, if you're selling pre-roll and mid-roll and post-roll ads, but your consumption shows that most of your listeners are only getting 40% through a show, your mid-roll and your post-roll ads are never really going to be heard, at least not by the general populace. Maybe your super users, they are. So again, when you take that into consideration, if you're selling a ton of mid-roll ads or sponsorships, if no one's really listening to them, well, that means that your advertiser, your sponsor, is probably not going to come back for a second, a third, or a fourth campaign, because they're going to see like, well, the pre-roll looked great, but nobody actually listened to the mid-roll and the post-roll. So yeah, I think that's outside of like just the pure download number. Looking at consumption is obviously a big thing. And then also looking at some of the extensions. So extensions, I would include social, I would include newsletters, I would include, maybe some like in-person or community things as well. I talked to an advertiser, a guy who's been with many of like the top podcast advertising companies in the world, like the sponsors that you hear multiple times as you're consuming shows. And one of the things that they're looking at is like, how do we get product placement? And how much more valuable is our product sitting on a desk of somebody that's going out and done a viral clip that ends up getting, into the YouTube algorithm or to the TikTok algorithm and that sort of thing. So again, extensions are going to be a huge component of this as well.
I love that. And I think, again, with the data that you guys are always coming out with, I hope everybody who's listening will go and check out what you guys have, because you're always posting it to just support the community as a greater. And so really grateful for that. So obviously AI plays such a big role in a podcaster's life these days. With the increasing use of it, how do you feel it can support a podcaster, and how do you feel it can be detrimental to a podcaster?
Yeah, I think there's always going to be that signal to noise ratio regardless. And AI has really accelerated that, especially with content. I won't get too deep into like the Google LLM notebook, where people are basically just uploading like very long forms of text. And then all of a sudden they've got an interaction between a couple of different hosts and or guests. I don't know if we'd even call that a podcast. I know I think there are a couple of companies that are tracking like the number of AI only podcasts that exist now.
Really?
That's not something that we look at. So like if we move past the pure content generation perspective, I do think that AI is unlocking a lot of new opportunities. And again, I can speak to this at least from the Podchaser side, because targeting has become such an important aspect of podcast sponsorships and activations for brands that we work with. And when you think about like all the things you could query a podcast about, right? It started out as podcast name and podcast description, or podcast title, podcast description. That put a lot of pressure on podcasters themselves. Well, how do I come up with a hooky or a punchy podcast title or a premise that's going to get people interested to click play for the first time and also keep them coming back. You move past the title and the description, you move towards episode titles and episode descriptions. The same kind of problem exists there too. How do I create an episode title that is going to capture the attention and get them to listen, and then hopefully makes good on the promise or the premise of the episode itself? But again, that put a ton of pressure on individual podcasters. One of the things that we're doing and we're currently working on and should be releasing maybe in time for when this episode goes live is adding transcripts to that as well. So again, when you can take transcripts, and we currently transcribe every podcast that's part of the top 24,000 podcasts, English-speaking podcasts in the world. When you add the transcript layer to that, it opens up a whole new world of ways to categorize and tag shows. And from an advertiser's perspective, if they want to find a show that's talking about something super niche, again, being able to tap into the transcripts and see like, what was the consumer sentiment or the podcaster sentiment about the release of a new, call it cell phone, like the latest and greatest Galaxy model, right? Like being able as an advertiser to be able to tap into that layer of data and information makes you so much smarter as opposed to just a show that's talking about random tech reviews, right? So again, taking some of that emphasis off of the podcaster to go out and again, make these punchy, hooky titles, and then now opening this up even further to much greater depth of content, I think is going to do a lot of really significant things for podcasters, especially when demand for podcast advertising has never been higher, at least in my experience, having worked in this industry for a few years now.
Well, I think that's really exciting. So to clarify, you're saying that like on Acast, you guys are working, and Podchaser, you guys are working on basically taking the transcripts from the shows that are in your platform and you're putting them into almost like a database of transcripts?
Pretty much, yeah. And then you can query those transcripts across keyword searches, across phrases. You can then go do more big data stuff with them, getting access to like the raw files and all of that as well. So again, instead of like the podcaster having to categorize themselves per Apple and Spotify's kind of like chart categories and subcategories, this is like one of the things I think a lot of folks don't understand. Like you set those categories within the different platforms, but if you're set in that platform and an advertiser or brand goes in and only looks at Apple Podcasts categories, business, subcategory, marketing, and you just happen to talk about marketing but more so through like a finance lens, you're never really going to be discovered from that perspective. But if we assess like the transcript and we see that you're talking about marketing through the context of like CFO decision making about where dollars are going to be spent with marketing, that's something we didn't know before, and that's something that is only accessible thanks to transcript analysis.
Oh, okay. That's so awesome. I love that. Well, I'm excited. Do you know when you'll be rolling that out?
Hopefully by the end of Q1, but if not, early Q2.
Okay. Keep us posted for sure. All right. Well, I just have a couple more questions. So one, what obviously you just shared about the transcripts, but what other things does Podchaser have up your sleeve for 2025 to support podcasters? What are you guys excited about? What are you excited about beyond Podchaser, but for the industry as a whole?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, as an industry, I think, again, with this rich multimedia, with the introduction of video, with taking this unstructured audio content and then making it more structured through text content, through the transcript side, like we've barely even scratched the surface in terms of understanding like what is actually happening in terms of podcast conversations. And we know that it's important, again, because of this parasocial relationship that exists. Most listeners are going to treat the podcaster as like a trust proxy. And I think about it all the time. It's like the podcast that I listen to, if they're endorsing or talking about a certain brand or a certain service or tool that they're using, usually I go out and I check it out. And we've got survey data that supports that most people that are listening to podcasts are way more receptive to learning about new products and actually trying new products than literally any other medium. So that's very exciting, I think, if you're a podcaster. And then, some of the other things that we're working on is the continuation of AI and what that can do for us. So we released a feature back in December called Tell Me Why. Basically how it works is brands and agencies upload a creative brief to the system. And then based on the creative brief, it'll spit back a fit score based on the campaign goals. So let's say, I'm an athleisure brand and I'm targeting women aged 25 to 34 that have an interest in yoga. What you could do as a brand is then upload that and then run it through our system. And then it'll say, yeah, this podcast is an 8 out of 10 because the audience is primarily women aged 25 to 34 that have an interest in athleisure, that are interested in yoga, that also like travel products. And I think about it like when we travel, my wife and I, like she's not wearing her Sunday best on the plane. She's trying to wear the latest and greatest athleisure because it is an element of, kind of societal pervasiveness when it comes to that. Right. So this Tell Me Why feature has been huge for us. It's been awesome for our clients to get out there and use it. Because again, when we talk about like the sea of podcasts, like we have 5.6 million shows within our database, and how to separate, even the top 10,000 to the ones that matter most to you, I think is a huge part of that. So AI, I don't think is going to go away. In a perfect world, what we'd love to see is somebody could just go into Podchaser and ask a simple question like, show me all the podcasts that, XYZ thought leader has appeared on and tell me the sentiment of the conversation. Like that would be something that more generative AI is going to help us be able to unlock. And again, that has major implications from an industry perspective too, from the advertiser side, from a content creator side. If you know that these are high demand, like conversations that are happening based on Google trend data or like the social zeitgeist that we're seeing on social media or cultural zeitgeist. Again, that's going to help you kind of structure your show around trending things potentially. And obviously trending is always going to sell through more too. So those would be a couple of things that I would point out.
Well, that's exciting. That sounds awesome. I would love that platform that gives me that much good data and information to make. I mean, it would just make our lives as podcasters so easy to just plan out our content and collaborate and all that good stuff. So walk us through what it's like to work with Podchaser.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting because we sit kind of in the intersection of content creators, networks and publishers, and then brands and advertisers, and then even more so like with agencies. So like whether it's a PR agency or advertising agency. So we've really started to understand like what matters most to all these different groups and kind of subgroups, if you will. We've got a very collaborative team, especially with our integration with Acast, our parent company, the things that are going on in the background in terms of tech capabilities and all these fun features that I'm talking about. It's just really accelerated kind of product development and understanding where the market's moving. So I know we've got big initiatives around the video explosion. We've got big initiatives around the AI adoption. But I think, again, what's super unique is I can go from talking to a brand and understanding why they're now taking 10% of their marketing budget off of Google and Facebook and putting into podcasts because they believe in the medium. They know that there's been this huge kind of growth trajectory, especially over the last 6 months. So then our job is to help them find content creators that are going to align with them and represent their brand really well. And again, from like the network side, how do we do this at a more scalable pace? So instead of just one content creator, are there 10 content creators within a network that can help deliver what the brands are seeking and that sort of thing? So again, we leverage data to do so much of this. And I would say, I'm obviously biased, but the more data that you can get around decisions, it's obviously going to help you in the long run.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the decisions. The data made decisions. So, and I can hear that from you as well. So I love that. Well, to finish up with one fun question, if you could sit down with any podcaster, who would it be and what would you ask them?
Yeah, I've got to meet a lot of the podcasters that I listen to, which is really cool. But there's one that I haven't been able to reach, and that is Tim Dillon. He's a comedian, and he has a solo show that he does, and it's usually about an hour, sometimes 2 hours long. And it looks like he does it basically unscripted. Now, I know enough about the industry and how it works that there's so much work that goes into pre-production, but the way that he's able to take even like his sponsorships and like intertwine them into the segments that he's doing in his program, I don't know where he comes up with this. I think that might just be a natural gift that he has as a comedian and leveraging observational comedy. But just understanding, like, it looks like he just rolls out of bed and just hits record and it goes off seamlessly. But There's so much craftsmanship that goes into it. And I would really love to see, like, from start to finish, how does he approach an episode, and how does he pick which topics to cover? How does he pick which sponsors to work with? So that would be a really interesting one.
Oh yeah, I do think it is like a gift when there is a sponsorship that you're like, oh, we're into a sponsorship already. Like I
Yeah.
didn't even realize the transition, so that's fun. Well, Trent, I'm so glad that you could join me today. This was such a fun and insightful interview. And where can everybody go learn about you, your show, and Podchaser?
Yeah. So I publish a lot of the data that we're talking about on LinkedIn. So Trent Anderson on LinkedIn, or Trent Anderson Podchaser on LinkedIn.
I'll link it up.
Yeah, perfect. And then we also publish weekly insights in our newsletter called Podchaser Pulse. So if you don't subscribe to that, there's about 24,000 folks that are reading this on a weekly basis. We do some fun data stories in there too. So like after the whole social media firestorm that existed post Super Bowl with the kind of the battle between Olipop and Poppy, the two prebiotic soda brands, we were able to look at what podcasts were saying about them and kind of understand what the impact was in that medium and how that kind of continued some of the controversy around their Super Bowl marketing plays. So again, just a little teaser. If you're interested in those types of things, that's what we cover on a weekly basis in the Pulse newsletter.
Amazing. Well, thank you. Thank you for all of the important stuff that you guys are doing in the industry. We really appreciate it.
Cheers, Kylie. Thanks so much for having me on.